The Quran presents an eschatological paradox regarding the architecture of reality. On the Day of Judgment, the entity known as Shaytan stands before humanity and makes a final, structural confession in verse 14:22. He states publicly that he possessed no authority, no physical force, and no power to compel human action. His only capability was to issue an invitation. If the architect of human ruin operated with zero actual power, we are left with a structural tension. How does a force with no physical mass successfully engineer the collapse of entire civilizations? Massive, mathematically precise empires, societies built on exact engineering and strict hierarchy, all eventually succumbed to this completely unseen, massless influence. Shaytan's threat bypassed military or physical vectors, operating instead as an invisible exploit in the structural code of human consciousness. Verse 1572 isolates the specific mechanism of this exploit. It describes a state of lahum, a frenzied, intoxicated thermodynamic noise. This noise functions as a virus, designed to short-circuit the divine architecture of reality by corrupting how the human mind processes incoming information. The terminal goal of this revenge engine is to completely silence the living, continuous signal of reality, which the Quran represents physically and metaphorically as the feminine principle. By reverse engineering this system of corruption, from its origin point down to the suppression of the buried daughter described in verse 81:8, we can map exactly how the universe is wired. Tracking how this noise destroyed past systems provides us with the specific mathematical mechanism required to reboot the system today. This 3D architecture maps what we call a dual caustic system. The universe is governed by two interacting fields of information. The vertical golden beams represent the L field, or light. This is the divine command, truth, and constraint. It acts as the particle, or masculine principle, discrete, stable, and fixed. The horizontal blue waves represent the S field, or sound. This is lived experience, flow, and mercy. It operates as the wave, or continuous maternal principle, diffuse, relational, and oscillating. Direct contact between raw L light and S sound produces immediate annihilation. The unmediated command and the continuous lived experience cannot touch without destroying the system. They require a mediator. The mediator is the B field, or buffer. This represents human consciousness, or nafs. It acts as the decoherent zone, the space where quantum probabilities resolve into definite states, allowing light and sound to safely interact and generate reality. A healthy reality requires both the masculine particle of command and the feminine wave of mercy to maintain balance within this human consciousness buffer. This diagram shows how Shaytan's weapon of noise, the 1572 interference, actively attacks this healthy buffer. It operates at the root of human desire, bending the inputs so they fail to meet. This creates a Mobius twist. The system inverts and begins feeding entirely on itself, completely cutting off the L-field command. The historical archetype of Lutz people demonstrates this physics metaphor in action. Their crime was a literal inversion of the L-field, where the wave turned back on itself in a closed, self-referential loop, rejecting the external divine command. We see the same corruption in the archetype of Babel, with Harut and Marut. This represents a host-body transaction, humans willingly renting out their buffer to thermodynamic noise in exchange for temporary worldly power. The old wife archetype, seen in the narratives of Lut and Noah, represents this corruption operating from within the containment matrix itself. It compresses and blocks the true signal before it can escape the system. And human consciousness accepts this noise. It executes a willful disconnection from the divine command. The result is an isolated reality, entirely consumed by its own destructive feedback loop. The terminal output of a noise-corrupted reality is the Pharaoh equation, the ego enthroning itself as God, replacing the divine command with its own mass. This network circuit illustrates Pharaoh's mechanism of control. He systematically killed the male prophetic signal, the L-field particles, to prevent any external divine command from entering his system. Conversely, he let the daughters live, but trapped them. He weaponized the S field, isolating the continuous wave of the feminine principle and using it purely as an instrument to power his own central structure. Samiri introduces a parallel corruption vector. He weaponized the non-touch property of the angelic L field to forge the golden calf, engineering a dead loop of pure, unguided desire. Tyranny is an engineered physics problem. It deliberately drains masculine truth action to overcharge a corrupted feminine containment matrix. The revenge engine always produces a tree with no root. By isolating the fields, the system guarantees its own thermodynamic collapse. This flat-lined blue wave buried beneath static represents the structural proof of this corrupted architecture, the buried daughter of verse 81:8. The buried daughter represents the pure last signal, completely severed before it can complete its wave arc. It is the systemic silencing of the maternal feminine sound field. Within this corrupted system, women like Pharaoh's wife Asiya and Musa's mother are forced to become zero-crossing operators. They must hold the divine signal in total, unnamed silence, hiding it within the noise just to keep the information alive. This is the darkest point in the architecture. Shaytan's noise successfully convinced humanity to bury its own capacity for mercy and continuous life. The questioning of the buried daughter in verses 81:8 and 9, for what sin was she killed, functions as a systemic reboot. This question acts as a quantum measurement. It forces the corrupted wave function to collapse, exposing the truth that was hidden in the void. This diagram shows how that measurement uncompresses the silenced data. It restores the voice of the S field, giving testimony back to the buried daughter and shattering the suppression. The divine architecture planted this reversal precisely in the nodes Shaytan assumed were dead, the barren wife of Ibrahim and the isolated Maryam. Maryam's cry of childbirth in verse 19:23 is the exact coordinate where the sound field is restored, finally breaking the curse of silence. The divine system is anti-fragile. The very act of burying the truth turns it into the precise trigger required to reboot the universe. The immediate consequence of this system reboot is the total collapse of the noise. The revenge engine shatters because its foundational mass was an illusion. This brings the framework full circle, back to the day of standing and Shaytan's confession in verse 14:22. Shaytan confesses his lack of power because the restored sound field demonstrates that he never had the functional capability to override the human buffer. The architecture of tyranny was a hollow call. It only generated reality because human consciousness actively chose to answer it, renting out its buffer to carry the noise. The voice of the buried daughter is the recovery of the lost protocol. It stands as permanent proof that mercy and continuity ultimately outlast noise. The dual caustic architecture remains active today. The noise is still broadcasting, but the choice of whether it enters the buffer remains entirely in our hands.